the end of the 1st century AD, the soldier Tiberius Claudius Vitalis crossed the river Danube and reached the end of the world. Trained to obey, he went. In the war to come, victory would hang upon such discipline. The greatest weapon of the greatest army the world had yet seen. At the height of its power, Rome, the greatest nation in the world, was paying tribute to barbarians. From their mountain strongholds north of the river Danube, the Dacians gnawed at the empire. 2 Roman armies tried to crush them. Both were crushed. An entire region simply vanished. Rome tried to buy peace, but the Dacians broke the bargain. Now the new emperor Trajan took up the sword and called up his legions. 100,000 men, 1/3 of the Roman army. One of the legionaries who followed him to war was a 30-year-old veteran, Tiberius Claudius Vitalis. As a boy of 17 from Rome, Tiberius swore an oath to the emperor. Ever since, his home had been the army. He had already given his youth to his country. A dozen more years of service of the 25 he had promised loomed before him. When he signed on, life in the army had beguiled him with status and adventure, and regular pay. Now he was tempted by survival. Of every 2 legionaries he marched with, one would not live out his term. Somewhere within its empire, in trouble spots from Britannia to Judea, Rome was forever at war. In the beginning, conquests had been made by part-time soldiers. By the time of Christ, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, rested on the swords of the legions, an army of professionals. From a village of mud huts on an Italian hillside, Rome itself had become the greatest city in the world. A capital of 1 million people, ruling an empire of 60 million. This was the world through Roman eyes. A civilized land surrounded by barbarians who never ceased to bay and scratch at its borders. Tiberius was stationed on the frontier where the barbarians barked loudest. Legion 5 Macedonia took its name from the place it was founded, but now his troop was based below the river Danube, the border between Roman civilization and the Dacian wilderness. It was to put down such uprisings that men like Tiberius were trained. A Jew who observed legionaries in Judea discovered the key to their success.
They do not wait for war to begin before handling their arms, nor do they sit idle in peacetime. But as if born ready armed, they never have a break from training. It would not be far from the truth to call their drills bloodless battles, their battles bloody drills. That is why they stand so easily the strain of battle. No indiscipline dislodges them from their formation. No panic incapacitates them. No toil wears them down. So victory over men not so trained follows as a matter of course.
When young Tiberius enlisted, he spent 6 months drilling twice a day. Mock battles with wicker shields and wooden swords, twice as heavy as his real weapons, and wielded just as harshly. "13 years later, he still drilled daily and ran 3 miles. 3 times a month, he slogged through a route march, a 20-mile trek in full armor and equipment, no matter what the weather. The legionary earned his nickname of Mule. When Tiberius set out to meet the Dacians, he was weighed down with weapons and armor, but also axe, pick, saw, cookpot, 3 days' rations of grain, 70 pounds in all. His legion was accompanied by all the professions a soldier might need: blacksmiths and bookkeepers, veterinarians and doctors. Directed by their engineers and architects, the legionaries began the war against the Dacians by building. Taking up the tools of stonemasons and carpenters, they erected a chain of forts to guard their line of supply against Dacian raids. Behind these walls, men like Tiberius, city-bred, immersed themselves in the comforts of Rome. They were encouraged by their officers in martial pastimes. Yet they indulged the vices of all soldiers: drink and dice and other diversions. Marriage was forbidden, but in practice, legionaries found wives, or mistresses, among the locals. Along the road down which the men just came, letters went back, mundane and melancholy.
Send beans, chickens, 100 apples if you can find nice ones, 100 or 200 eggs if they are for sale at a fair price, fish sauce, olives. Cratius de Veldeus, his brother, an old messmate. Very many greetings. And I ask you, brother Veldeus, I am surprised that you have written nothing back to me for such a long time, whether you've heard anything from our elders. Best wishes to our sister. Solemnis to Paris, his brother. Very many greetings. I want you to know that I'm in very good health, as I hope you are in turn. You neglectful man, who have sent me not even one letter. I have sent you socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants.
As a dozen legions gathered across the Danube, the Dacians withdrew to the mountain fortresses that ringed their capital. The legions prepared to follow. Trajan summoned his officers for a final council of war. The men sacrificed an ox, a sheep, and a pig to the gods. Priests read the entrails for omens. The Romans crossed the Danube in two great columns, one led by the emperor himself. Like his men, Trajan too sought glory in battle. The legionaries hacked their way through the first enemy they met, a forest ill-suited for travel, much less for the Roman way of fighting. At dusk, they became builders again. As the Dacian spies watched, the legionaries fortified the ground they would sleep on.
Whenever they invade hostile territory, they rigidly refuse to do battle until they have fortified their camp. This they do not construct haphazardly. If the ground is uneven, it is thoroughly leveled. Then the site is marked out as a rectangle. In the gaps between the towers, they mount spear throwers, catapults, stone throwers, and every type of ordnance, all ready to be discharged. The fortifications completed, the men go to their quarters unit by unit in a quiet and orderly fashion. Nothing whatever is done without orders. All other duties are carried out with attention to discipline and security. Wood, food, and water, as required, being brought in by the units detailed.
At the far end of a long day, the 8 men in Tiberius's squad pitched their tent and prepared a Spartan meal. If they were resourceful, they supplemented this with whatever they could catch. Then most bedded down. The unfortunate few took up their watch, and woe to him who fell asleep. If he were lucky, he would simply be whipped by an officer. If not, he would be stoned to death by his comrades. After many days of slow progress, the 2 long Roman columns, stretched out for 20 miles, met at Tibiscum. Trajan sent his cavalry ahead to find the enemy and flush out ambushes. These horsemen, like the other auxiliaries, the archers and slingers, were recruited from conquered tribes. Only citizens of Rome could serve in a Roman legion. But the prize of citizenship could be won by the foreign-born upon their discharge, if not sooner, for bravery. Near the pass of Tapai, the gateway to Dacia, Trajan's horsemen found the entire Dacian army drawn up. The emperor gave the order for battle. After weeks of cutting trees and building forts, the legionaries relished the chance to fight. Tiberius went into combat better armored than any soldier of his day. The mail worn by his predecessors had been replaced by the lorica segmentata, a breastplate of metal sheets connected by hooks and straps and conforming to his joints. When he moved, so did his armor, unless rusted by rain. His iron helmet protected his face and neck without obscuring his vision. Tiberius took his position on the battlefield. His unit of 8 formed a squad. 10 such squads formed a century, commanded by a centurion. 6 centuries formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts formed a legion. No such discipline prevailed opposite Tiberius. The Dacians wielded long scythes and made room to use them. Within their horde, each man would fight alone, even to the death. Tiberius might fight heroically, but not singly. He was part of a machine. To the 7 men beside him, he was friend and comrade. To the Emperor Trajan, this squad was like one creature, trained to obey, without delay, without question.
So complete is their submission to their superiors, that in the field the whole army is a single body. So knit together are their ranks.
As the Dacians brandished their weapons and hurled their jeers, Tiberius and his comrades silently advanced. He flung his pilum, his javelin, at the enemy. The neck was long and thin, so that wherever it struck, in wood or in bone, it buckled so no Dacian could fling it back. Then, wielding his gladius, a short sword with a wide blade, Tiberius met his foe. Slashing and thrusting, both sides fought until they could fight no more. Then, by agreement, they rested. Again, they came to blows. So it went, until the Dacians turned and fled into the forest, an obstacle that broke up the Roman formations and the pursuit. The legionaries had won the battle, but not the campaign. They had failed to take the Dacian capital. With winter approaching, Trajan marched his army back to winter quarters below the Danube. En route, Tiberius and his comrades sold their prisoners to the slave traders who followed the army. In the spring of 102 AD, Trajan again crossed the Danube. This time, he sent one column far to the north to attack the enemy capital from behind. Abandoning the field, the Dacians retreated into their strongholds, whose strength would now be tested by a Roman siege. Trajan brought up his artillery, ballista firing arrows, and catapults hurling stones, not to dent the Dacians' battlements, but to clear them. Under the barrage of missiles and the hail from slingers and archers, few Dacians dared show their heads, so few saw what came next. Holding their shields overhead, the legionaries advanced toward the walls in the tortoise-like formation they called the testudo. Within it, Tiberius was almost blind, but nearly invincible.
To such a great extent are they perfectly protected that both javelins from above are received as if on a roof, and stones large enough to fill a wagon do not break apart the bond, but rolling down by their momentum, fall to the ground.
Under such onslaughts, so purposeful and so relentless, the Dacians' strongholds and finally their capital were taken. Their king signed a treaty of peace, and just as quickly broke it. For this second affront, the Romans so punished the Dacians that they would not mock Rome a third time. Tens of thousands of prisoners were taken, and, as elsewhere in the empire, the conquerors came to settle among the conquered. When in time they left, Dacia had come to be called Romania. A legionary's odds of surviving 25 years of service were at best even. But if he did survive, he would be granted a farm carved from land he had fought over. There he might live out his days in comfort and honor, bearing his scars to family and neighbors, and recalling his hours of peril and moments of glory. For their valor, the bravest of the legionaries were rewarded with armbands and medals. More honors lay in a higher rank or a better posting. Tiberius was among those so favored. He was promoted to Legion I Italica, one of the most prestigious units in the Roman army. How his life ended, by accident, disease, or the sword, is not known. Only that it ended early. At age 41, 1 year from retirement from the service of Rome, he died.
Rome was founded, according to legend, by Romulus in 753 BC. It began its expansion almost immediately, first conquering the lands of the Italian peoples, and then extending its domain until an empire was created that stretched from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia all the way to the Euphrates River. Historians date the fall of the Western Roman Empire to 476 AD, meaning that the history of this city and its dominion over the world spanned an entire millennium. How was it able to last so long? The answer is, Rome not only conquered lands, it adopted them, blending the customs and habits of various civilizations with the best that Rome had to offer. In Vaison-la-Romaine, France, once a Roman province known as Gaul, archaeologists uncovered this paved road bordered by impressive buildings. At its entryways, the researchers noticed some strange grooves. What were they for? When presented with a puzzle like this, archaeologists often find important clues in ancient architectural writings, preserved by medieval scribes. In the case of Vaison-la-Romaine, the mystery was solved. The grooves in the thresholds supported wooden tables where merchants displayed their goods. By positioning the tables along the roadway, merchants enjoyed maximum visibility for their products and therefore had more success. This emphasis on marketing and commerce was one of the reasons why the empire remained vital for so long. Wherever the Romans arrived, weapons were laid down eventually, and the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, took their place. Within this context of renewed stability, business was able to thrive. Eventually, after Rome had invaded and inhabited a new land, it would take the best soldiers of that country and incorporate them into its own army. The best of these recruits would have come from wealthy families. They were usually better educated and trained, with natural aspirations to rise through the system of their new ruling government. If they succeeded in battle and the political aspects of war, they might have the chance to become senator, one of the highest and wealthiest positions in the empire. A military career was the fastest route to furthering one's career. Of course, the new soldiers had to start at the bottom. They would be sent to battles in the easternmost borders of the empire, where Emperor Trajan was fighting the formidable Parni, the heirs of the Persians. From France, they would embark with a small military fleet on a voyage from Massilia, now Marseille, to Sicily, and forced to fight pirates along the way. From Sicily, the voyage would continue to the Orient, following the fastest and safest route possible. This meant following the coastline and only crossing open sea where necessary. The fleet would thread its way across the Aegean through the Peloponnesus to reach the port of Laodicea in Syria. Warships at that time were a lot different than merchant ships. This boat is called a trireme. We know how it looked because of information from relics recovered by marine archaeologists. They discovered that in order to be able to make quick maneuvers in battle and ram the enemy, warships were propelled by several layers of oarsmen. Merchant ships, on the other hand, used sails and had no oars. Warships were classified by the number and arrangement of oarsmen. The trireme had 3 tiers of oars, and each oar was manned by 2 oarsmen. It was a lightweight fighting ship, about 115 feet long, and perfect for hunting pirates because it was fast and agile. Naval soldiers manned the ship together with the oarsmen and were there to board enemy ships. Each trireme had a crew of about 300 oarsmen and 100 naval soldiers. To rid the vast waters of the Mediterranean and the Aegean of pirates, the fleet would often give chase, sometimes for hundreds of miles, to catch its enemy. Once caught, the tactic was not to board the enemy ship and engage in hand-to-hand combat, but to sink it, either by ramming it or hitting it with catapult fire. A ship positioned broadside exposed itself to a greater risk of being rammed and sunk than its attacker, but that position offered advantages for the use of its catapult. This is because the rolling waves had 2 different effects on the arc of the projectiles. The defending ship catapult, positioned perpendicular to the main axis, hurled projectiles that fell inside an elongated ellipse, a form which corresponded perfectly to the shape and position of the attacking ship. The attacking ship, on the other hand, had its catapult aligned with its main axis, and its projectiles tended to fall within a circle that encompassed only a minimal part of the target ship. Oftentimes, the attacker's missiles missed their target, and the tides of battle would shift. A soldier's life was not all war. Roman culture demanded a certain refinement and taste among its subjects. This theater in Tyndaris is on the northeast coast of Sicily, overlooking the sea, where many voyagers and soldiers stopped on their journeys. What is both striking and intriguing about this structure is not so much its architecture or finishings, but rather its location. It is stunning, but it lacks a logical explanation. Having a theater exposed to the sea winds and the full sun, since the shows were offered during the daytime, seemed to be a very questionable choice. Other theaters, such as the very steep one in Pergamum, Turkey, had sweeping horizons to look out onto. That was what Hellenic tastes demanded. Every architectural work had to have something magnificent about it. The Tyndaris Theater, like much of the city, was not actually built by the Romans, but rather by the Greeks several centuries earlier during the Hellenistic era. The Romans simply absorbed it into their empire. One of the reasons for the size and strength of the Roman Empire was its assimilation of Greek culture, which was imitated and developed even further, as in the art of mosaics, and then spread throughout the empire. In the interior of Sicily was a flourishing city, Morgantina. Sumptuous dwellings adorned with splendid mosaics testify to its wealth. One of the ways it demonstrated its prosperity was the gracious hospitality offered to strangers. We see evidence in this mosaic, which contains the Greek phrase, "be well," which may be taken as a sort of welcome. All citizens of the empire were equal. People and ideas were allowed to circulate freely, as were goods. The governor of the island, as well as its year-round inhabitants, would extend the celebrated Roman hospitality to all visitors, offering wine, meat, and all the produce of the fertile Sicilian soil, part of the Italian terra firma, a land that Virgil called an earthly paradise, mighty mother of crops and mother of men. Sometimes an army's mission was not of war, but of peace. On the Greek island of Santorini was an early settlement called Thera. Thera was located in an area that was always at risk for earthquakes. Half of the island disappeared into the sea in the 2nd millennium BC. The archaeological remains of Thera show that the city was rebuilt several times because it was hit by an earthquake more than once. The earthquakes would seriously damage public and private buildings, and on occasion, the Roman army would be assigned to carry out civil engineering projects, digging wells, clearing roads, restoring hygiene. An army officer could distinguish himself further by performing these public duties in a successful fashion. Moving further east, toward the outer reaches of the empire, we entered Jordan. Archaeologists working during the last century uncovered a beautiful city, Gerasa. They were quite puzzled to find numerous drain covers like this one, bearing the engraved image of a dolphin. This animal is clearly associated with the sea, although Gerasa was surrounded by desert and far from the coast. What mysterious meaning did this hide? Excavation work revealed a very rich city over the course of decades and offered clues to archaeologists as to what relationship Gerasa might have had with water. One of the city's most important monuments is the Nymphaeum, an impressively decorated fountain. These channels in the paving stones served to carry away the water. The city was thus laced with small rivulets of water. A sensational discovery emerged from the study of the grand colonnade that crossed the city. At the tops of the columns, encased in the architraves, there were water conduits. Gerasa had a complex water distribution system. The water that filled the streams during the rainy season was diverted, collected, and conveyed all around the city, where it was used ostentatiously before draining off along the various channels. This system was certainly wasteful, but that is precisely why it was a source of pride to the city. With its ample supply of water and its monuments, including this temple dedicated to Zeus built in a panoramic position atop 3 terraces, Gerasa projected an image of beauty and hospitality, as befitted its status as one of the ancient world's most important marketplaces. The city was at the eastern border of the Roman Empire, an area of intense commercial traffic between the Mediterranean to the west and India and China to the east. Gerasa had to compete for commerce with other cities in the same zone, such as Palmyra and Petra, and hence had to offer a wide range of quality services and entertainment, as seen in its 2 theaters, its mineral baths, and the stadium. Its hospitality is highlighted by this magnificent oval plaza, for which Gerasa is world famous. The oval plaza of Gerasa is a symbol of the Roman Empire. An imposing colonnaded avenue penetrates the city and ends in this picturesque plaza. It is clear that the most beautiful and important cities of the empire, even the more distant ones like Gerasa, owed their stature to the excellent routes connecting them. The plaza, or the forum, as the Romans liked to call the city's most important meeting place, was always the end point of a road. This oval plaza stands as a testament to the most important reason for the survival of the Roman Empire, its road system. The efficiency of these road networks could be admired today. There were postal stations, armed guards, constant upkeep of the surface, and over 75,000 miles of roads. Gerasa was the eastern outpost of the empire. From here, Roman soldiers would travel through dunes across a boundless desert and encounter a culture and civilization unlike anything they had ever known. The caustic people who lived in this area between the Euphrates and the Indus rivers made even Romans tremble. This was the land of the Parni, the heirs of the Persians. The Romans would be forced to call upon their formidable battle tactics to defeat this bellicose enemy. There would be 5 or 6 tribunes in command of several divisions. The tribunes would report to a legate of the emperor, the top commander of the legion. Under the tribunes were the centurions, an elite force of men who commanded the centuries, groups of 100 soldiers. When engaging the Parni on the battlefield, the Romans would utilize their well-established military techniques. The cavalry would be deployed along the flanks. In the center, facing the enemy army, there would be 4 rows of infantry, with the centuries in a staggered array to close any gaps. The first to attack were the Velites, a light force that carried out swift strikes and then took refuge behind the lines. Next, the Lancers advanced, hurling their javelins and then engaging in hand-to-hand combat before retreating. And then it was the turn of the Princeps, and lastly, the Triarii, armed with lance and sword. The attacks continued in the same order repeatedly until all 4 lines, flanked by the cavalry, launched the final assault. If they won the first battle, the Romans would face a much more arduous challenge, the siege of a city. The army would camp about half a mile from the walls and would set these ominous war machines, efficient and effective catapults, upon pedestals. Catapults could shoot arrows, or, when necessary, rocks. When the army laid siege to a city, they used rocks as missiles to break openings in the walls so that the army could invade. The rocks would need to hit the same point again and again. This was achieved by loading the catapult with projectiles of the same weight after carrying out several launch tests and choosing the proper position in which to set the machine. The rocks weighed up to 175 pounds and had a maximum range of 700 yards. In order to launch them at high speed toward the adversary's walls, the rocks were placed in a sack at the center of a rope tied to each of the arms of a bow, held in tension by a system of twisted ropes. A winch drew back the rope, which would then snap forward and hurl the projectile when the ring attached to the sack was released. Along with the catapult bombardment, the Romans would use other war machines as well. The tower was one of their strongest assault weapons. Its sides were closed, but could be opened at different levels when needed. On the intermediate floors, there were catapults armed with arrows and rocks. On the upper floors, there were soldiers ready to make the assault when the towers were next to the enemy walls. On the bottom floor, there was the battering ram. When the wall had been breached, the tribune would give the signal to his centurions to attack and make their victorious entrance into the city. With Trajan's victory over the Parni, the Roman Empire reached its greatest expansion. A well-decorated officer could return home and follow the cursus honorum, the way of honor, a strictly regimented Roman ladder of promotion. With the right battle honors, they could win a much-desired senatorial appointment and sit in on the empire's most important assembly. Roman senators were fighters too, but in a different way. They would use weapons of diplomacy, equitable application of law, and wise economic and political administration to maintain the stability of all that the army had achieved. The empire was an immense domain that encompassed the entire known world at the time. The legacy was one of the most powerful in world history.
At the height of its power, Rome, the greatest nation in the world, was paying tribute to barbarians. From their mountain strongholds north of the river Danube, the Dacians gnawed at the empire. 2 Roman armies tried to crush them. Both were crushed. An entire region simply vanished. Rome tried to buy peace, but the Dacians broke the bargain. Now the new emperor Trajan took up the sword and called up his legions. 100,000 men, 1/3 of the Roman army. One of the legionaries who followed him to war was a 30-year of 17 from Rome, Tiberius swore an oath to the emperor. Ever since, his home had been the army. He had already given his youth to his country. A dozen more years of service of the 25 he had... A capital of 1 million people, ruling an empire of 60 million. This was the world through Roman eyes. A civilized land surrounded by barbarians who never ceased to bay and scratch at its borders. Tiberius was stationed on the frontier where the barbarians barked loudest. Legion 5 Macedonia took its name from the place it was founded, but now his troop was based below the river Danube, the border between Roman civilization and the Dacian wilderness. At the end of the 1st century AD, the soldier Tiberius Claudius Vitalis crossed the river Danube and reached the end of the world. Trained to obey, he went. In the war to come, victory would hang upon such discipline. The greatest weapon of the greatest army the world had yet seen. Promised loomed before him. When he signed on, life in the army had beguiled him with status and adventure, and regular pay. Now he was tempted by survival. Of every 2 legionaries he marched with, one would not live out his term. Somewhere within its empire, in trouble spots from Britannia to Judea, Rome was forever at war. In the beginning, conquests had been made by part-time soldiers. By the time of Christ, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, rested on the swords of the legions, an army of professionals. From a village of mud huts on an Italian hillside, Rome itself had become the greatest city in the world.